Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. And I see that the music server that you saw earlier, John, with that little dashboard, yeah, that was not working as good. Oh, there it is!
There it is. Now it's working. Good.
That's really funny. All righty, welcome back, everyone. This is, of course, Enterprise Security Weekly with your hosts, Paul and John. We're going to talk about using open source software in the enterprise. Now, John, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and this is really kind of going back to our conversations how in our own startup, Offensive Countermeasures, sales at offensivecountermeasures.com, by the way, short little plug there, but we decided we were like, hey, look, let's just give something away for free. Let's make it open source. Let's give it away for free. That's a good place to start. It's a slippery slope. Certainly, John and I being huge fans of the security community feels good to give back to the community and let people use something for free, but then tie that into a model where if you want more, well, then there's a software that we sell to supplement that. And I think that's a great strategy. But it kind of got us thinking as we went from enterprise to enterprise and started talking with people about, well, what are you using for network monitoring? And a lot of people said Bro, and we talked about some previous episodes. Mm-hmm. And then I got to thinking, like, when we do calls like for INS, I like to have an open source option as well. So over the years, doing calls with people and recommending solutions, I'm like, there are free or open source versions that could help you. It seems to me, John, that in the past 10 years, and more specifically 5 years, that a lot of these open source tools have gotten really good. Now, I would imagine that you'd agree with me when I say, I think you need to have a deeper skill set and maybe more people to pull this off, perhaps. Would you agree with that?
So this is dicey. All right. So, all right. I guess we'll just be completely honest. For most organizations, I would say no. There's no way you can do an open source stack. You just can't. There's some things you can do, firewall, IDS.
But is that because of the skill set, or is that because of the specific technologies that just... Or both?
Without question, it's the skill set.
Okay.
Without question, it's the skill set, because you talk about a lot of our...
I don't want to. You don't want to make it seem like we're saying that no one out there has the skill set to do this, because obviously there are people that do have the skill set to do it. When you get into certain areas, you might need specific skill sets and much deeper experience and training that not the majority of people just don't have today in enterprise networks that are defending enterprise networks, right?
But here's the problem. With the companies that we're testing, even the companies that are buying commercial softwares, if they don't have those skill sets, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And this is something that's kind of hard, right? Point. So if you have the skill set for open source, you're probably going to have a skill set that's good for security for open source and for commercial software. If you don't have the skill set for open source, you can get the illusion and the veneer that you have a security program by purchasing highly polished security tools. But at the end of the day, if you don't know what an alert from Carbon Black or Tanium or any of these products, what it actually means on the end and the endpoint itself, you're screwed either way. You just spent a lot more money getting to the point where you're screwed. And this is just really hard. I don't, because I know we're going to piss people off. So we go through it. We talk about firewalls. If you don't understand how firewall architecture works at all, I don't care what firewall you're using, Palo Alto, Fortinet, any of those, you're still screwed. But your internal architecture is going to be broken. However, if somebody shows up and they're like, yeah, I can totally do this with IP tables, it may take them longer. But the end product, whether or not it's open source or closed source, is still going to be better in the end than it would be with somebody with a commercial tool who didn't know what the hell they were doing. Is that too cynical? I think that's too cynical, but it's true.
Let's talk about firewalls for a moment, because I feel like this is an area where open source, up to a certain point, like really doesn't shine at all. Like I think once you get to a certain point, you're going to be looking at a firewall from Cisco, from Juniper, from Palo Alto at a certain point, just because of, I don't know, the features that you need, the throughput that it has to have.
Yep.
Or do you believe that you could you build your own hardware? I think there's a point where, like, getting your own hardware to do what the Ciscos and Palo Altos and Junipers of the world do is next to impossible, if not impossible, right?
Well, let's like Palo Alto, one of the things you talk about is like application level inspection, right? Going down into the actual application itself. And I'm not talking about web application. I'm talking about going through and looking at the protocols, SSH, things of that nature. There's really not a lot of good open source tools that allow you to do that effectively.
Agree.
So that would be the place where Palo Alto would shine. But if somebody doesn't know what the hell they're doing and all of a sudden stuff isn't working, that's going to be the first thing they shut off in their Palo Alto because they don't know what the hell they're doing. So I still think at the end of the day, you're going to end up at the same place if you don't actually learn what it is your firewall actually does and how it actually works. And I think open source is a great place to start and then slowly start building it. And then once you get to that point where the open source toolkit isn't doing what you want and you're buying that product, then you're paying for the difference in what the commercial product provides that the open source product does not, rather than, a vendor coming in and being like, yeah, stateful packet inspection, we'll sell that to you for $10,000. And there's something out there that does it for free. So I'm very cynical on this because even if you have the shiny, awesome tools, it'd be like if you or I sat behind the wheel of an F1 race car, right? We would die. We get into a race, we'd be dead. It doesn't matter how shiny, how fast, how awesome, how expensive that car is. Without the skill set, you and I are dead behind the wheel. So there's got to be some type of skill tier associated with organizations. And I many times will say, like for SIM, you have a choice of spending $200,000 on a SIM product, or you can hire somebody that watches event logs like you and I watch television for $175. Go hire the person that understands the actual technology and what you're doing before you get the product, and then build the product around that.
Completely agree. Before we get to log monitoring, though, I want to talk about network monitoring with intrusion detection systems and general network monitoring. Suricata and Bro come to mind. I feel like this is an area, and you may need to have a commercial application or hardware solution, software and hardware solution like Gigamon to pull it off, but the actual monitoring of the traffic, like the collection, you're going to have to go buy hardware, but the analyzing of the traffic for intrusions, for threat hunting, for just detecting anomalous behavior on the network, I firmly believe, and have for quite some time, that open source tools with the right person running them that's where it's at in terms of network monitoring. Would you agree? Disagree?
I would agree. I would agree 110%. And I heard an interesting story. I was talking with someone that had worked with some very high profile companies that have the good security teams. These are security teams where they hire developers that understand Golang, they understand Python, they can write in C and C++, they can code around the problems that the organization actually has. And he said something like 70% of the time when they're looking at a vendor comes in and does a dog and pony show and shows them what their cool product does. Their CIO sits down with their security team and basically says, hey guys, how long is it going to take for you to write something that does that? Security team brainstorms on it. And they're like, yeah, we can write that in about a month. Do it. But those teams have that type of skill set, have the coding ability, the scripting capability to make that happen. Those security teams win when you're pen testing. They're awesome ninjas. They have those types of skills, and a lot of times they build it on open source tool sets and then extend it outbound. So I think that's another interesting kind of perspective on this as well.
Yeah, and I think log collection and analyzing logs is certainly an area up to a certain point where you can get good mileage and you can get a lot of great information provided you can develop the right tools. And it's going to reach a point where, and the point where I see you crossing over into a commercial tool, John, and I love the way you describe, like, you should be paying for the features that aren't provided in an open source tool, like above and beyond that. And I think a SIM and the spaces that it's kind of delved off into, where basically for 2 years they've been funded, they've hired some really smart PhDs, and they're doing artificial intelligence and machine learning, like actual artificial intelligence, machine learning, to solve this problem. That those are the areas where you're going to probably want to go buy something. But generalized monitoring, you can do yourself. And then for the very specific areas where you're seeing it solving a problem, very few organizations are going to be able to replicate what some of these smaller companies are doing with all of this log data. Do you agree or disagree?
Yep. No, I agree 110%. And also, I agree with log, but then the other one that I wanted to get your opinion on is endpoint protection. I mean, there's not a lot of open source endpoint protection suites out there.
I couldn't think of any
at all.
Can you?
The closest the closest thing I can think of is not necessarily endpoint protection per se, but it ties in with incident response would be GUR. And GUR is free and it's open source. It's funded and maintained by Google, and it's awesome.
What is GUR? I've heard of GUR, but what is GUR?
So with GUR, you can actually install an agent, and it works on Linux, works on OS X, works on Windows. And there's things that you can do, like you can actually do file system access, you can do forensics with the sleuth kit. You can actually pull memory down and do memory analysis using Recall, which is another tool from Google as well. But it is cool, and it's one of those things I've been meaning about trying to do a tech segment in GUR for quite some time. But GUR is just wicked awesome, and a lot of the companies that we work with that use GUR, that have actually spent the time building and installing GUR, they love it, and they deal with a lot of vendors that are in that space, and they're like, yeah, we can do that with GUR, and it's free, and it works really well. It can be a little bit intimidating getting installed. Once again, if you don't know what you're doing, it looks like it's really, really, really hard to actually set it up and configure it, and that would be where a lot of people would go off and just buy a tool that comes in like a 2U rack that they plug in, and magically it has an HTML5 interface that works. But GUR would be one of those things that's open source that is awesome that I'd look into.
Nice. Incident response. We talked about cyber CPR. Is that the one?
No. Okay. So cyber CPR is really, really cool, but it's not open source.
It's
all right.
Freemium.
Freemium. It's freemium. Yeah, it's definitely freemium. It's free for up to 5 users. And for most people, that's all that they would ever need. So that's another company that we absolutely love. You give something away for free for 5 users, kind of like the Cloud Passage model, which is pretty cool.
But there are a lot of, and you just mentioned GUR, which is actually an open sourced incident response tool for actually collecting evidence, which can be extended to do other things. And I've seen a lot of different incident response open source projects recently. GUR looks like it's very similar, but much grander scale than some of the other ones, which is awesome.
Yep.
And then we get to threat intelligence.
There's the webcast that we did. There was a great link. I'd have to pull it back up, but it's a Git archive where you can basically pull down all the different feeds and all the different formats and all the different open source free tools and even some commercial tools for threat intelligence. It seems like there's a lot of platforms for ingesting feeds and displaying that data. So this would be one of those areas. If you're getting into threat intelligence, I would start with the start with the open source tools. Give me a second. I'll be able to get everyone that link. Start with the open source tools that are out there. And then basically start looking at the commercial solutions to basically try to understand what it is that you're actually paying for. So the tool.
And have you used the collective intelligence framework before, John?
Yeah, around with it a little bit, and that one's really, really cool. But the Git archive is GitHub. The user is HS Latman, HSLATMAN, and it's awesome-threat-intelligence. And he's got great resources out there, and one of them is all the different frameworks that are available for threat intelligence. It seems like you definitely can do your own open source threat intelligence feeds. You absolutely could do that. And there's a lot of ways to actually approach that. There's tons of presentations. The guy that went after me at BrewCon, I can't remember his name, but he gave a presentation on how you can use Evernote to actually do threat intelligence feeds and aggregation and doing searches across multiple different feeds, which I thought was pretty cool.
He went after you at BrewCon?
Yeah, he went right after me. And it sucked because I'm like, threat intelligence feeds are crap. Rah, rah, rah. And he's like, okay, so I'm going to talk about how to do threat intelligence feeds. And I'm like, oh, no. Oh. So, yeah, I know, right?
That's what you get when you Hulk smash, dude.
Dude, but I don't know, man. All right, at any rate. But there are tons of tools out there in that GitHub. HS Latman or HSLATMAN on GitHub. Awesome threat intelligence. Go check it out. But yeah, there are tools that fit into this space as well.
What else with open source tools that you see in the enterprise, Joe? What other open source tools?
Forensics. That's the one thing that's kind of not. It would fall underneath kind of incident response, even though Rob Lee would be shaking his fists at me. But when we're looking at forensics analysis, you got autopsies, sleuth kit, and you have recall and volatility. So there's some great utilities out there for doing forensics. In fact, most good forensics analysts that we know, they are using these free and open source tools for some things. Now they still use things like Ncase or some of the other tools that are out there for doing analysis, but they have these open source tools in their toolkit because they're just that good.
Of course, vulnerability scanning would be another area.
is there any open source vulnerability? I mean, you can't even say Nmap scripting engine is in this category, right?
Well, it's not. It doesn't have the anywhere near. I mean, it's a minuscule amount of coverage. It's more of a tool for very specific use cases. OpenVAS does still have an implementation that is usable. Not as many, I think, plugins are created for that as maybe some of the other tools, but certainly it does things in different areas that maybe some of the other commercial tools don't.
Is it still pretty much built on Nessus 2.0 code?
Yeah. So
or did they completely redo it?
No, it was, well, I don't know. Today, I couldn't answer that. I'm sure there's people from they're involved with the OpenVAS. I was exchanging tweets with someone that was working on OpenVAS. We had HD Moore on one of our other shows. But from what I know is when Nessus was open source and then like the new versions from Tenable were closed sourced, right? The open source one is left out there, and that OpenVAS continued. And I think they've made great strides in the open source community for providing a product that does vulnerability scanning. And it's interesting how several vendors have taken that open source tree and integrated it into their products and done some other services with it, which typically are cheaper than getting like a full-scale vulnerability management solution, and they may have different use cases. For example, Pony Express uses OpenVAS on their sensors so that they can do a scanning and send that back to their repository, the central repository in the cloud. Who's the web? Acunetics. So Acunetics has a cloud-based service that says, hey, scan my web application. They've also got a kind of sister service that does, or at least did last year when I checked, or earlier this year when I checked. I'm not sure if they still offer it. I can look. But they offer a service that's basically based on OpenVAS that will scan your system remotely.
See, and the people from OpenVAS would be interesting to get on the show and talk to. But no, it's interesting. It sounds like looking at the website, it looks like it's matured quite a bit lately too.
Yeah, so Acunetics does have the network security scanner, which when I researched it was based on OpenVAS. I'm not sure if it still is. I can't confirm nor deny, but they do have a product for that as well, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
So
very, very cool.
I can't think of any other areas. I'm sure there's people screaming at us saying, what do you think about this area? And we'll cover this topic more because I think it's an interesting one because we did identify a couple of places where like at a certain point for an enterprise, you're going to want a commercial product. I think firewalls is definitely one of those. SIM was one of those in the different pockets. And we identified a bunch of other areas in endpoint protection, which really there's not anything that does that in open source, which is interesting. But in the areas of intrusion detection and network monitoring, open source was very strong. Incident response and threat intelligence, I think open source solutions are very strong. So I think coming out of this, I somewhat knew that there are going to be areas where you can totally use an open source solution and do it well. And that area is going to be different for other people. Like you said, John, there's something to be said about just getting a 1 or 2U rack mount device and having it do it. But have the skills to be able to configure, tune, and monitor and verify that device is working as intended. Very important. So there may just be decisions you need to make and say, you know what, for our firewalls, we're totally going with something we can just like rack mount and we're going to verify that it's working the way it should. But for intrusion detection network monitoring, we're going to invest a lot in open source. And then, you know what, in some of these other areas, we may lean towards a commercial product so that we can spend more time on doing intrusion detection and network monitoring in an open source sense. So I think you can customize how much and where your open source software benefits your enterprise. I think it'd be really cool if John and I were sitting here today going, yeah, you don't need to buy any products. Like you can just totally do everything open source. That's not the case. But it's not the opposite case either where you have to buy something for everything and everyone's going to fall in between, which I think is really cool.
Absolutely.
Closing thoughts on anything else we want to talk about, offensive countermeasures related? I know we get the new interface that we're working on.
I would just say be watching. We're going to release the second iteration of the interface here shortly, and we're going to be loading it up on AWS. hopefully by the end of the year, if not January, and people will be able to click on it and integrate it into their AWS infrastructure and set it up and get it running. So really excited about that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching to Enterprise Security Weekly. We'll see everyone not next week because it's Thanksgiving. It's the day after Thanksgiving. So the following week. Thanks, everyone.